Nicki Purcell, you've hired agencies, run agencies, rebuilt digital teams. You've helped some of the biggest brands in the world scale. And so in this episode, I want to cover three things: how to hire, evaluate, and partner with an agency, the future of web design, and managing and scaling digital or marketing teams. So, Nicki, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And so, having led multiple agencies yourself, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see in the engagements when hiring an agency?
Well, I think it probably depends a little bit on what a company or someone is looking for when they're hiring an agency. I tend to be on the agency side to think about it from a much more custom approach. I feel like agencies exist because they're service providers. And if they can listen well and understand the scope of a client, then they're going to customize what that solution looks like. So, to answer your question directly, it just may be that a lot of folks feel like agencies have rate cards and a very static way of addressing a problem. And perhaps some of the best ones are ones that listen well, ask a lot of questions, and come up with a custom solution.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on working with a full service agency versus ones that are more specialized in different services?
Well, again, I think it depends on the
Yeah.
need. So every company and marketing team is in a very different place. And so if it is around strategy and ultimately the execution of it can be done in part with an in-house team, it may be that you're looking for someone who specializes in strategy and that's where their case studies exist and that's where their experience is. If ultimately you know going into the engagement that you're going to need a full turnkey agency, that's going to be something that you put more weight on when you're evaluating the right partner.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you're searching for an agency, let's say you've identified the problem that you have, what's usually the first steps you do to actually go about finding that sort of partnership?
Well, I think my first step's going to be researching,
Yeah.
doing some background check with folks that are connected to those agencies. Even though a lot of people have fantastic web fronts and can position some case studies, nothing beats the human experience, and talking to people that have worked with them directly is a really big
Yeah.
help with you.
Yeah. And do you also feel that in the engagements that you've done, just doing a random internet search for a partner versus a referral, you've had a lot more success with referrals? Because it seems like that's been the more common thing that I've been noticing is that, especially at the higher levels, companies will just ask their network, hey, do you know a partner for this, and go with that partner rather than a traditional search for an agency.
I
Yeah.
definitely think that's how the majority of it happens, both
Yeah.
sides, honestly. Whether it was my experience leading an agency and getting new business and filling that pipeline, oftentimes we would find we were in pitches and conversations because it was connection that we had somewhere. Ultimately, for the reason I kind of mentioned before,
Yeah.
a lot of people do reach out to their network first because of that firsthand experience and knowing that they are going to be in good hands and that someone else has had a really good experience, because it's just really difficult in a very noisy space to filter just based on how people show up via their own website.
Yeah. And do you find that the strategies you've used for deciding or finding the agency to work with has changed, in the years you've been in business? Like, is there a new strategy that people are using in the last decade or in 2026? Or is your thought on that kind of been forever the same?
I think the framework for a strategy is really the same for finding a new agency partner. And
Mhm.
that's going to be really defining what it is that you're asking them to do. So
Yeah.
the more clear you can get with the scope so that you can identify a partner with the right fit is going to be always part of that process. In fact, I would say even driving it all the way through creating a rubric. Identifying like the five non-negotiables, for example,
Yeah.
and then when you're talking to those agencies, making sure that you're ranking them in as non-biased way as possible. What's certainly changed over, you mentioned the decade or where we're focused in 2026 is that technology continues to evolve. And so what I think the biggest thing is just being sort of in technology and potentially loving that portion of it myself is
Yeah.
how an agency is adapting themselves to take on new tools, to take on new skill sets so that they can pass that experience onto you and your business and the partnership. And so
Mhm.
that's something that I think is definitely changed, and certainly one of the things that's going to continue to evolve as AI takes off, and just, ultimately the way we see things today is going to be very different in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And along those notes, are there any other big red flags that you see when you're looking at an agency to consider, or any good stories that you might have from the past or anything like that?
There's any major red flags, I feel
Yeah.
like it's one of those things where they've got to hit the table stakes in terms of requirements and having had experience in what you're
Mhm.
searching for. Certainly, red flag could be if you talk with someone and they haven't expressed just a
Yeah.
phenomenal experience of working with them.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think it really comes down to their ability to communicate to you why they are the one that should be chosen, and you'll get a
Mhm.
gut feel in those conversations and on those pitches as well.
Yeah. And on the other side, do you have any good tips for just in general, approaches that you have and insights you have when looking to work with an agency? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that, ultimately being on the agency side, if you're, custom and you're listening for cues and trying to figure out what exactly the problem is for
Mhm.
that client that you're trying to solve, for me, the biggest thing is to be able to sort of punt on pricing as long as you
Mhm.
can. And I think that ultimately this decision comes very quickly to pricing, and it can get in the way of having a really
Mhm.
comprehensive discussion around really what you're trying to accomplish. And so
Yeah.
you've got a client that might start with at least a perceived budget. You've got an agency that might start with a perceived cost, but it feels very much like both partners are eager to get to the middle and see if we're even in the right price range.
Mhm.
And that can supersede oftentimes getting agreement and alignment on what the scope is to be done. And so
Yeah.
that's just advice that I would give on both sides of that relationship is trying to, not leap to that price point first
Mhm.
to potentially take a partner out of the mix before you've
Yeah.
even actually clarified scope.
Yeah. And do you see any, in the past agencies you've worked with, any characteristics of what has made a partnership work long term versus what has ended a partnership early?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
long term, what really does make a big difference, and we're talking multiple years, right,
Mhm.
is when an agency and a client partnership thrive based on common goals. And I
Mhm.
know that, what you're hearing me sort of beat the drum on quite a
Yeah.
bit in this conversation is communication, but it really does come down to that. And I think that
Mhm.
agencies in the end want those clients to be successful,
Mhm.
and they want that for themselves, but also their clients. And so oftentimes the relationships that last are the ones that the clients are most transparent about in terms of what
Mhm.
the success is look like. So if you can provide data, if you can provide goals, if you can know how the client partner is going to be measured by their own sort of internal management, and then
Mhm.
work together to collaborate and achieve that success, that's where you'll start to see a multi-year relationship form because
Mhm.
everybody's in it for the same reasons. If
Yeah.
ultimately that transparency is hard to get at, sharing the data from internal information of how a campaign performed, for example, an agency might not thrive in delivering that because they're only seeing half of the story. And so ultimately, the more transparent and the more upfront and defined that the goals are, I think the better.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And so before I move on to the next section, which I mentioned, is there anything else that's super crucial for working with an agency or any other good stories or tips you've had that you think is important to mention?
I just think that a lot of times a client comes into a picture
Hmm.
of working with an agency with very defined expectations. And my only advice would be is to keep those options open. So I know that, I've talked a lot about like making sure the scope is clear,
Yeah.
but a big reason that you're hiring an agency or an outside partner is to bring a different perspective. And
Yeah.
so as clear as you can be, as much as you can define the scope, presenting that back to the partner, but doing so with an open mind I think is where it leads to the best outcome.
Yeah, I completely agree. And on the second note, which I wanted to cover, and you are a very interesting guest in the regard of web design because you've sold websites to the highest level and to the biggest companies in the world. Obviously, that's what we do. So I think this will be a good part of the conversation. So, what are some of the most important things that you look for in a website?
I think it's identifying what the
Yeah.
website's role is. I mean, there are
Mhm.
many companies who need a website for brand credibility and to be able to leverage that as part of their sales pipeline. People are going to be coming to that website to do research. They're going to be
Mhm.
trying to kick the tires, identify case studies, and understand really if that's the right partner for them. In that case, spending more time on the strategy, spending more time on the content, the media that's associated with it is going to be really key.
Mhm.
Knowing, however, that a completely different side of that, maybe a website in the consumer journey or the end sales
Mhm.
process is much more transactional. It might
Yeah.
be a lot less about the story, the narrative,
Mhm.
or ultimately helping to drive credibility. And it might be much more about conversion rate optimization.
Mhm.
So recognizing up front what the role of that website is in that journey and what the
Mhm.
success is defined as can vary widely in terms of what the success of the website needs to be and therefore where the focus of that website needs to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you see a lot of the times in the engagements you've done that there's almost this conflict between design and performance or like design and strategy? I always bring the example up of there's a ton of different other agencies we worked with that have amazing websites, but they're a little bit too hard to navigate. The call to action might be at the bottom instead of the top right where it usually is. So do you see that kind of clashing a lot in like the discussions you've had for web design?
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
think that it's a tendency for folks to want to put everything on the website.
Yeah.
And so they want to have a section that's about the narrative and they want to be able to talk about the history of their company. And that may not be a bad idea, but again, it goes back to the strategy. And if you spend a lot of time with that upfront content and what you really do is sell a product or a good that can be transacted right there, that can be something that is
Mhm.
distracting. And, to your point, sometimes that distraction isn't necessarily content, it can be design. So
Yeah.
getting a little over the top and trying to be super creative can backfire if it's just too hard to navigate.
Mhm.
You got to keep in mind how many people are looking at that site from a mobile device, and they've got, roughly a 4 or 5 inch screen to navigate. And sometimes a lot of the stuff in the
Mhm.
way is just really going against one of the principles that I try to think of, which is don't make me think.
Yeah.
As a web visitor to a website, I don't want to have to wonder why something's in a certain place or where I should click in order to get the information I'm looking for.
Yeah. And so what got you into web design in the beginning and what kind of led you to sell that as some of your services at some of these larger companies you've run?
Well, I've always been someone who's just interested in technology, and I've loved the ability for what technology can bring to people, and websites are a natural part of that. When I first started in this, it was many years ago. I worked for actually a public relations agency that
Mhm.
didn't offer web design. It was strictly public relations. So, conversations with analysts, with other media partners, et cetera. But it was for clients that were in the high tech space. And what I came to recognize in those relationships with the media and the analysts, et cetera, is that they were going to go back to these companies' websites in order to do due diligence in the reporting that they were covering. And honestly, some of the startups we worked with, because they could afford a PR firm, but not a digital agency, had a terrible website. And I thought, oh, this is where this is going to actually crater because that person who's, inherently interested, we've been able to
Mhm.
help them understand, why this company is important. They go back to their website and it's terrible, and then it just sort of loses the credibility. And so at that juncture, I actually went to the lead of that agency and said, I believe we should be full service and not just a PR firm if we can stomach this. But I think we need to grow into a space where we offer websites. It's a big part of the story. And I
Mhm.
think it's really critical for the success we have with our clients. So
Yeah.
that's the expansion. And in doing so, I sort of volunteered myself to figure out how to translate what was, a PR relationship agency into one that was inclusive of websites. And so it was jump in with both feet and figure it out.
Yeah, there's so many different questions just in that. The one point I always bring up is because most firms don't actually derive sales just from their website. They might, if they're an e-commerce company, sure, but a lot of companies, it's almost there to validate your credibility, to display your information. I see a lot of companies missing that, so I can agree on that completely. And what was that transformation like, being more specialized, or at least not offering web design, to then bringing that into the fold in addition to all the other services you've done?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges that we had was on the account service side. The folks at the agency were very accustomed to the same solutions, right, when it came to PR, and that didn't include web design. And so, what we had to do in order to make that expansion happen is look outside of our company for skill sets that weren't inside. So, primarily, that was built off of finding fantastic web designers at the time, amazing coders, folks who could join us from a freelance perspective if we got as we got started and scaled to eventually bring those folks on full time. So
Yeah.
that was one of the lessons learned is that, the skill set is not 100% translatable, particularly when you come to technology and just understanding how and where you can go to get that, especially as digital skills are evolving so quickly.
Yeah, that makes sense. And were there any other services you brought on in addition? Like you brought in web design that added to the PR values, or any other services you had done at the time?
Yeah, we actually, at the start, or at least I personally just wanted to do web design in addition to PR because of what I described, which is I knew that was a tool that a lot of these folks were going to do further research. Having said that, the way that we expanded this is we went to each of the clients that we felt like needed a website and potentially other things, and we started talking to them about the other marketing services we're offering. And David, not surprisingly, all of them didn't need the same thing. Some of them said, yeah, we probably could use a better website, but you know what I need right now? I really need a brochure and some, slick data sheets to take to this next trade show. Can you help me with that? And I
Mhm.
was like, ugh, yeah, we can do that.
Yeah.
So ultimately, there were other services that they identified that we didn't have, in the mix initially that,
Mhm.
if we wanted to be able to fully service that client, we needed to bring on board. And that's ultimately what we did.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, another five different directions I want to take that. And I know we've had conversations for ourselves because we do offer branding work, but we mainly do web design. And so you kind of see that different pull between, you want to offer these sort of things to a client, but some clients want this versus that. And so, looking back at that experience, what would you recommend to another agency when they're thinking of adding service lines to their business?
Well, I think that's one of the quintessential and most difficult, questions to answer for an
Mhm.
agency. Do you specialize and become sort of the expert, if you will, in a particular area?
Mhm.
Or do you offer more services in order to scale and grow faster? And I think
Mhm.
that you can scale and grow fast when you're hyper specialized. And it's just a challenge. You have to be able to
Mhm.
ask yourself how comfortable you are with the ramp up period, how comfortable you are with the marketing effort to be able to say, gosh, just to be, in a self sustainable area in a very specialized area, it's going to take a lot more focus, a lot more effort to be
Mhm.
able to get there to become that sort of SME of that space. It's easier, I feel like, to be able to offer more services,
Mhm.
at least in order to close the sales. Now,
Yeah.
the flip side of that is that you have to find the resources there to also make sure that you can offer those additional services and do so in a way that it keeps the quality where you want it to be. So I would not say that's an easy question to answer. And
Yeah.
sadly, without dodging it myself, I feel like it's going to be dependent
Yeah.
on the leadership of that agency to start to ask the day-to-day questions of where they feel more comfortable
Yeah.
and how long they have in the ramp up period and what their growth goals are.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it is this, in a perfect world, offering more services done at the same level is better than not. But it's just the resource constraint of if you add these other services, they're going to dilute the quality and your marketing and all that sort of stuff. Um, and so for a website, have you seen, the trends change over the last, decade or so of offering this sort of service? And things that companies are looking for now that wasn't necessarily looked for, 10 years ago plus for a website.
Yeah, well, I mean, I almost find it funny that we're talking about 10 years ago because
Yeah.
truly, David, I feel like the world has changed in 10 years. I would suggest that even in the last 2 years, things have changed
Yeah.
significantly. Now, everyone can say, oh, it's AI. And ultimately, those two little letters conjure up either fear or excitement, depending on which side of that you sit on.
Mhm.
But it truly has changed things in the last couple of years, primarily because well, there's two major things. One, I would say, is how websites get built. Ultimately, everything was done by coders, and there was code assist, and there were templates, et cetera. But the difference now is just staggering in terms of how many tools and capabilities it has to be able
Mhm.
to change the way that the websites are built to begin with. The second thing I think is how consumer behavior has changed.
Mhm.
So, SEO is still a really important part about driving traffic, both organic and paid. But answer engine optimization, or also called, GEO, that's taken on, a completely new question that I think clients are asking for, which is how will I know once this is built that the framework and the content and everything that's built within it are going to make sure that I surface in an LLM like ChatGPT, because so many people are going to do search in chat as much as they are Google or Gemini. And so ultimately, it's not just about what's changed in
Mhm.
the web development world, it's what's changed in the consumer approach as it comes to websites.
Yeah. And for, we get a lot of requests for geo and things like that. What are your thoughts on that as an industry um and offering that service in general? And yeah, what do you think that that's a big conversation amongst a lot of the other CEOs and CMOs you talk to?
Honestly, I feel like at CEOs and CMO level, it is still something that they're wrapping their heads around.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where AI is everywhere, so everybody believes that everyone has the same perception of where it's at right now and that they are,
Mhm.
quite frankly, behind. So I think that you get those questions from the
Mhm.
C-suite often, but it's not because they necessarily have the answers or know, hey, this is something that I know the difference of what we should be doing. It's because they're asking and they're trying to
Yeah.
make sure that they're not falling behind. I do believe that, again, definitions matter, right? And so, should GEO be a question and should that be something that web agencies are addressing right now?
Mhm.
Absolutely. Because, like I said, a lot of people are going to these LLMs in order to use it as they were using search. The
Mhm.
one thing that I would say is very different about where we're going in AI is that we have an entire separate sort of internet, if you will, that is built around agents. And at the end of the day, back when I was doing websites, we did not want bot traffic. Bot
Mhm.
traffic was traffic that was coming in that wasn't consuming ads,
Mhm.
or if it was, it wasn't human, so it was difficult to actually monetize. And in a really bad situation, bot traffic could sort of tank your site if the
Yeah.
traffic got really high and it was, on the border of being sort of a DDoS attack. Now, the reality is that bots are not necessarily malicious traffic that's just driving up sort of clicks. It can actually be meaningful, intentional agents that people have built to go
Mhm.
out to sites in order to have tasks driven by autonomous AI.
Mhm.
And there is a statistic out there right now that says, in 2026 already, about 50% of all traffic is agents, it's bots. And so
Yeah.
when you think about that and you recognize how that's going to change things, it really does cause you to think about what the role of your website is. And if there
Mhm.
are going to be two, sort of parallel paths of the internet, one that's built between transactions and agents, and then
Mhm.
one that is intentionally made for the humans in the loop or the consumer traffic, that's going to really change the way that you evaluate what you're building and what you're making available to those agents. Because there's a lot of
Mhm.
technology now that enables you to stop agent traffic. And it's
Mhm.
not for the purposes of just stopping it because back in the day that was all negative bot traffic. It's
Yeah.
because you want to make sure you can monetize whatever that agent's coming to get. And so this traffic and this strategy of monetization has changed dramatically as a result of the agentic, web at this stage.
Yeah, I actually haven't thought about it in that sort, and I could see that that could be very harming to a company's data for their website. They're tracking where all the users are coming from, and you might have, 80% of the traffic is agents, and how do you kind of parse through that data? So do you see that that's also where the pressure is going to be, is in terms of how you can collect data with all these agents coming in?
For sure, because you have to be
Yeah.
able to separate what the traffic is that are consumers that might purchase
Mhm.
and what the agents are that are coming in to manage a different task for it. So, I mean,
Yeah.
the one thing that can overlap certainly is depending on the sophistication of the agent, it may make a purchase on behalf of,
Mhm.
a human. And so it may not be that you have to separate it entirely and go, here's an audience that could buy, here's one that can't because it's AI. The truth is AI can buy. And so at the end of the day, it's about just segmenting the data to be able to have knowledge around what's, various traffic sources and what they're doing.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to the original point of you really want to just know the role of the website, because if it's just, if you're a company where that data of having autonomous agents to your website is not helpful, being able to, and I don't know if they figured this out yet, but parse out that sort of information versus just regular organic users. So I think that would be an interesting, pressure of the future, in the near future, honestly, because AI agents are getting better every single day. Are there any other ways in which you see AI affecting web design or websites as a whole?
Well, I think that we've heard this, and that when people are building tools to ultimately have really long documents read or summarized, or even think about someone who's job hunting, they build a resume and they think this looks amazing. And oftentimes they hear, well, it's not really built in such a way that AI can read it. So when you're thinking about the fact that a lot of people are taking long documents, resumes, getting AI to do summaries of it and to be able to report back, there's a structure that helps AI read those in a way. So
Mhm.
I feel like the biggest thing that, we have to think through is, where we started, which is what's the purpose of the site and what are you building it for? And recognizing that, we have information now that helps us identify if something, external than a human is viewing it, how they're viewing it, what they're pulling from it. So
Yeah.
ultimately, it's really paying attention to how fast this is evolving and building to meet those needs.
Yeah. And I wrote a question down, which I think ties perfectly to this segment, which is, you know, if I were to ask you a few years ago, how do you build a future proof website? It'd probably be an easier answer than this. But at this point, if you're trying to build a website that's going to last you, because you're going to have your website for years and years without rechanging it and things like that. So how do you build a future proof website now that AI is here and things are changing so quickly?
Well, I think that's a funny question because everybody would want to build a future-proof website because you think I don't have to reinvest in this, right? In fact, if you go, by public accounting rules, web development and like GAAP accounting is a 3-year amortization, which basically says if you're going to build web development projects, an application, website, etc., you have 3 years to be able to amortize that, and it kind of indicates that that's the longevity of that product. It's like it is a capital investment, right? And I just think now that what you're building is the bones of a website. The fact that you can future proof, I think, is not super realistic. I think what you have to do is commit to a strategy, build the framework, and recognize that you're always going to be evolving. We know that the speed at which AI is changing things is like something we haven't seen before. So if you're building something in 2026 and your expectation is that you won't have to edit or evolve it, into 2029, it's probably not realistic.
Yeah.
And that, it's just a different approach to suggest that you're building something with the right framework, the right structure to be able to evolve it. And maybe that is sort of the hidden answer in this question, which is the way you future proof is you get out ahead of what can evolve and the
Yeah.
flexibility it provides you in the future. So don't pick a programming language that could be obsolete. We used to have the saying where we want to be, cutting edge, not bleeding edge. So if
Mhm.
you select something too quickly and then it's sort of a technology that disappears in 6 months or a year, you're sort of left there. So, making the consistent choices on programming languages, on frameworks, etc., I think is your best bet for enabling that evolution because things are going to change at a rapid pace.
Yeah, it's almost that the only way to future proof it is to build your site in a way that's flexible that you could change because you know that change is coming sooner than later.
That's right.
And I didn't know that about 3 years from in the accounting space. So do you kind of see that in the websites that you've sold that that's kind of been the recurring cycle of when people want to revisit, website changes or like redesigns as a whole is about 3 years in your experience?
It definitely varies on the client and the industry. I mean, some, as you mentioned, can live in a space where it's far more static. So, recognizing that the website strategy for a client is about building credibility, is about the narrative, is about the journey, that's probably not going to change as frequently because it's your company history. That's what you're trying to convey, is why you would select a particular company and for it to be a good match for you. I think a site that is much more transactionally based, that ultimately has to evolve with technology to take advantage of the new tools, that's something that's going to evolve a lot quicker. So I really think it depends primarily, again, based on the strategy, and just being flexible. But that also weighs into where you have the executives who come in and say, gosh, I feel like this is starting to look a little tired. I feel like we need to have a fresh look to this. So ultimately there is some opinion in there as well, but I love to live in the data analytics of it. And I feel like if something stops working for you in conversion or traffic and engagement, you'll see that in the data analytics and you'll have some good signs for that.
Yeah. And how much do you think about accessibility in the customer journey for the website, making sure that everything is smooth along that process when you're building a site?
Well, certainly in my current role, being a part of Morgan's inclusion initiative, I think about it all the time. But even prior to working, in a nonprofit that is focused on accessibility for everyone, we've always built, in my previous roles as CEO and president of custom software development firms, we've always built sites from the ground up to be accessible. Now, having said that, there's that governing body that helps you sort of with the primary guidelines that was set by the ADA, which is the, WCAG or WCAG. It's, up to 2.1, I believe now. That gives you great guidelines on accessibility. But I would say just like the ADA Act, which is such a big important piece for us, that's the baseline. That's the starting point. And so ultimately, when you're looking at accessibility and how to build that in a digital environment, really the only thing you can do, and I feel like there's no excuse for anything other than this, is to, make sure that you have folks who have various disabilities, both cognitive or physical, traverse your site and see what kind of friction points they have. Because
Yeah.
meeting just the bare minimum is really just that. And ultimately, there is a lot that you can gain from having a fully accessible experience for everybody.
Yeah. And before we move on to the third section, is there any other major tips for web design in general that come to mind?
Well, we just covered an important one, right? Which is
Yeah.
accessibility so that you don't have any particular audience that can't access your site. But, outside of that, the other thing I would say is that people tend to get more comfortable over time with interacting with technology. And so, at this day and age, a lot of times, and I've seen this happen and play out, in real time,
Mhm.
people often would rather interact with the tech at their own time and leisure than with a human. So if there is a way that you can not only provide FAQs, but even a chatbot that communicates as close to human as possible so they can
Mhm.
interact when they want and how they want, be thinking about that because you'll get a lot more interaction than you expect. Don't even think of it just in the sense that it quickly answers FAQs you didn't think about. We're finding in the chatbots on our site that the questions that the site visitors are asking are helping us identify the strategy and our go-to-market plan because they're phenomenal things that we might not have thought about. And so ultimately, just giving people as much ability to interact with your
Mhm.
site in technology that's made available, I think is a good tip because people will take advantage of it when it's there.
Yeah, and just to double down on that, I do believe that AI chatbots are going to become so valuable in the future. Do you see? I know you have them on the Morgan sites. Do you see that being an ever playing bigger role for the website as it goes into the next few years?
I do. I think that, everyone starts with where they think the FAQ should be, and those are
Mhm.
generally developed by people who are internal to the organization.
Mhm.
Ultimately, when you launch this, if you're using an AI chatbot, it might take a couple weeks before the accuracy gets up into the, high 80s, early 90%. But at the end of the day, it could be as simple as the terminology that you're using that's different than the majority of the traffic that's traversing your site. And then you go,
Mhm.
well, why are we calling it this when everyone else calls it this? And so just the pure education alone that you get from launching that and then enabling that and then improving upon it, I think is something that's going to be something that's here to stay for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and onto the third section. As I mentioned in the beginning, you've run agencies, which goes with, leading big marketing teams, scaling that. And so as an overview, what are some of the roles that you've had in marketing? And then we can get into maybe best tips, just for the audience who might not know yet, because I know you've worked at a lot of different companies and done a lot of things. Yeah.
I'd say at first, we talked about that experience I described before, which was
Mhm.
taking a PR agency and
Mhm.
expanding that to include web. At the time, there was very basic sort of technology and web development, and I didn't know what I didn't know. It wasn't what my degree was in, but it was something that, ultimately was fun, and I could depend a lot
Mhm.
on others to help fill in those gaps. Another role that I held, and really a company I worked for over 10 years was at Nokia. And, ultimately, there was an opportunity within Nokia for me to be able to lead the digital team and work directly on the websites. And so I had the opportunity to do that for obviously a very large global brand, in North America, and then move over to the online sales role within Nokia in North America, which really was defined by, making sure that we could sell across all of the sites in North America that hosted Nokia products and accessories. And so in thinking about that, that's where I had a real opportunity to really hone in on the conversion rate optimization and to optimize for sales, not just the marketing narrative and where those two things come together. So that's just a little bit about some of the roles that I held there. Going to work for the Dallas Morning News, which is obviously a large media publisher, very different expectation. The goal there is you're getting as much traffic as you possibly can. You are ultimately looking at revenue as a split between primarily anyway, subscribers who are paying for that content just as they are subscribing to media, but also, the advertising model. And so, you can have a site that just by being live and, strategically placing the right bets can make, millions and millions of dollars a year in revenue. And if you think about a site outage, you think about the criticality of your tech stack
Mhm.
and everything that goes with that. It's a super important decision to be made, based on, even if it went out for, heaven forbid, 2 to 5 minutes, just the
Yeah.
amount of revenue that you can lose in that time. So there's so many different ways to look at the value of the website and the criticality decisions that are made and how it's built.
I know we said we're going to go to the third section, but I have to ask you about those two things because that's a great point. So, for managing a website, and this also made my own curiosities as well. What is that like? Building a website for a professional services firm, or whatever the case may be, versus managing a website that probably has tens of thousands of visitors, maybe every day, every week. And on the other side, when you're working for the Dallas Morning News, when your website can go down for 5 minutes and it could lead to all this revenue loss. Like, what are those two experiences like, and how are they different? Yeah.
Well, I think that the first one is, you get a little bit more time, you get a little bit more strategy. So let me just give you
Mhm.
sort of Nokia, for example. Big global company, obviously the commerce that happens through the Nokia website or its partners, which are primarily carriers like your AT&T, Verizon, those are going to be built on a longer term strategy and a much larger build.
Mhm.
We actually built within Nokia what we called GOSP, which was our global online sales platform. So
Mhm.
instead of relying on a third-party partner that built our e-commerce channel, we built our own. That is not a small undertaking. It is gigantic. You're making decisions about where and how you gate the traffic and where you can, have concerns about fraud and which, handset models you sell into what and all those kind of decisions. When you are, managing a website like the Dallas Morning News, it's not even, gosh, just tens of thousands. This was years ago, and I'm sure the numbers are very different today, but we had 8 to 10 million unique visitors per month and, 23 to 25 million page views per month. And ultimately, in that scenario, decisions are very different. Decisions are going to be where you're spending a lot more time on, like I said, the infrastructure to make sure that everything stays live, up, and is doing what you need it to do, but also optimizing on an everyday basis. Because at the end of the day, that kind of traffic can have a significant impact if you're not optimizing for it.
Mhm.
And so building strategies around when to subscribe, when to serve ads, when to be able to drive something completely different via an affiliate program or e-commerce, it is much more built in the broader tools that you have to be sophisticated in a strategy on optimizing that type of traffic. So
Yeah.
it really kind of changes how much of your time is spent in what areas of, utilizing that website.
Yeah. And in the first example with Nokia, how long did it take to build that entire system? I'd imagine it could take years to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, in years, and then also, it's an evolution as well. So you build the
Mhm.
first pass of it, and then you start looking at data and recognizing how you can be more successful and where you can, sort of pull back on the reins. So um, I wish I could remember exactly how long it built to build sort of the
Yeah.
first version of GOSP, but all I know is it was certainly multiple years in terms of also that evolution.
Yeah. And what is it like trying to secure and maintain a site that large, or even for the Dallas Morning News, right? Because you want to make sure it doesn't go down for a single minute. Do you have any thoughts or frameworks around like securing and maintaining those sort of websites?
Well, again, I'm sure it's evolved significantly since,
Yeah.
I was working on it. I'll tell you, there was a big news story that happened in Dallas on my watch when I was in the chief digital officer role. And at the time, it was actually Apple News that reached out to me on my cell phone and said, "Hey, we want to link to the Dallas Morning News article of this because this is the story that's happening in Dallas." And I mean, as a publisher, that's a dream. I mean, can you imagine all the traffic coming from Apple News linking directly to your site? As a technology specialist, you better make sure that that site is ready to handle the traffic. Because at the end of the day, if there's not something that can scale up to those levels, you're in trouble. Like you're getting all the traffic you want, but you can't monetize it because ultimately, the site's going down and just can't manage that. So,
Yeah.
I would just say that the biggest thing there is making sure you have flexibility, which I know now listening to this conversation we're having kind of seems to be a central theme, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But ultimately that's going to be critical in that experience.
Yeah, it's crazy because even all the modern platforms that we see, you could handle thousands of visitors a day, but if you had, 100,000 or a million people come to your site in one day, I don't even know if a lot of these platforms on their plans can handle that sort of traffic. So, and then at the same time, it's the one time you don't want your site to go down because that's when you're going to get all of the revenue. So it's definitely a serious situation. So for the third section, you've led very large marketing teams. And so what is that kind of process like? And what are some good leadership tips you've had as you're trying to scale an agency and also just marketing teams at companies like Nokia?
Well, I think that there are a couple of things that I've always looked for in building teams, different qualities and candidates. And I would say it goes very similar to our sort of theme here of flexibility. It's less about an individual being flexible because most people are. I mean, most people recognize that they need to be and they have to evolve, and much more about how curious people are. So that's something that I look for in building teams is an individual's curiosity level so that they don't, sort of stay stuck in tasks they're given, but they ask why. Whether that's at an agency and they're working directly with a client, and the more they dig and the more they uncover, the better the solution is that we can offer that partner, or whether it's in a corporate environment and ultimately they're looking out for the best intentions of how we can grow a company. And so for me, I think that there's a couple things, and one is definitely curiosity, and the other is how you can build out as much of a diverse team as possible. And diversity isn't just about ethics, race, or anything like that. It's really about people's styles and how they show up to work and how they can complement each other in those various styles of that sort of cultural team.
Yeah. And then for the role of the CMO and marketing directors, things like that, do you see that that has evolved over the last, it could be a few years, 10 years plus? And if so, how has it evolved?
Well, I think let's just go maybe as far back as 10 years.
Yeah.
The CMO role was, if working with agencies, getting to go on a fantastic ride for defining things like Super Bowl ads and being super creative and how to break through the clutter and noise, whether that's, consumer or even trade. And sometimes what was rewarded was the most creative solution there was, right? We just came off of the heels of the Super Bowl, so you can see things that break through. Um, I think that really what has evolved is that there is an expectation now that the CMO isn't in a position to just drive brand awareness or even brand credibility, but the expectation is that they have to tie that to results and that the campaigns that are built, the tools that are used, the websites that are visited have to be something that can prove that that actual sort of investment in the brand is paying off in sales. And in order to do that, that means that oftentimes the CMO has to have a different skill level. They have to invest themselves in getting up to speed on the technologies, and they have to be very comfortable in the data analytics to be able to report back what they're seeing, and more importantly, how what they're doing is working. So I do
Yeah.
feel like over time, the criticality of technical skills and in particular data analytical skills has certainly evolved.
Do you find that it's almost harder to be a CMO or marketing leader today because of how many different channels there are to know? And now AI is coming, and there's a whole lot more to know than maybe there was, 10 plus years ago.
I definitely think that it could be more challenging, but I think that
Yeah.
there are two things that can be, thought about in this. I mean, just like we talked earlier about what is better. Is it better to specialize and be an agency that offers a very, hyper focused solution, or is it something that's a little bit more general and full service? I think what we see in marketing executives is the opportunity for them to really know their industry inside and out. And instead of being a marketer that's a generalist, they can be phenomenal at, say, how to build and maintain loyalty programs and in retention. They may be completely skilled in a particular industry that is very niche, and that in there can sort of translate to some of the skill set they can bring to the table that's above and beyond a generalist. And then certainly everyone's going to have a baseline, but being able to recognize within a very specific niche or skill level how it works for their space, I think is just going to be something that is a little more challenging than it used to be.
Yeah. Do you find that it's more important to have the knowledge more of the industry or like the skill set for the CMO? Let's say you're a CMO that's really talented in um, the specific. Actually, I don't know where I was going with that question. I think we're going to scratch that one. But on a different note, what's one mistake that you see marketing leaders make all the time, especially now as digital is rising and AI is coming as well?
I think marketing leaders that don't invest in themselves to make sure that they're keeping their skill set fresh and also adding those skills to their team. To me, that would be a mistake because I don't see us going back to a space where, we're enabling marketing to just be marketing for fun without the results and the expectation of it.
Mhm. And when you're looking to hire marketers in the organizations that you've worked at, do you have any tips when it comes to recruiting them, hiring them, and actually retaining that talent at your company?
Well, I think that there's a whole separate discussion that can be on,
Yeah.
just employee retention based on the culture. I think some has really, changed. We've entered the post-COVID era of hybrid work. We've obviously transitioned from, always in the office to sometimes not, to the benefits of being back in an office, et cetera. So retention of talent is broader certainly the marketing, I would say. But when
Mhm.
it comes to hiring, I think it's got to be a good blend of technical skills, but also that creativity that may not exist in other roles. And so, just because we've moved towards this space of needing to be able to measure the success of a campaign and to be, focused on sales and retention, you want your marketing people to have that spark of creativity and to love to watch, Super Bowl ads and go, gosh, that's great marketing, and to be able to articulate why and to want to be able to sort of chase that in their own work. So for me, I just feel like it's a balance of not getting so far focused, because after all, it is still marketing. It's about needing to cut through the noise and the clutter and to do something different. And so the spark of creativity, I think, is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting you brought up culture because that has been the one thing that's been brought up in every single episode. And said, do you have any good frameworks or thoughts when it comes to creating a good culture within a marketing team or an organization?
Well, I was having a discussion just the other day with somebody who was talking about how culture, changed really with various generations. And that's the thing that I think is really interesting is it's difficult to put yourself into someone else's shoes. And, for my sort of generation and age, we value flexibility, we value hybrid work. Now, I think a big part of that is because, growing up, if you will, in my career, it was, a little akin to running a marathon by the time I got to my office. I had three children, young, had to be, out the door to their respective schools. Plus, I had to be dressed to the nines in downtown, traversing, an hour rush hour commute in an office. And it just felt like exhausting. I mean, to be quite frank, right? But it's all I knew. And so at this stage, I go, gosh, who wouldn't take the flexibility that's provided now by tools like this, where we can be online and we can, manage the majority, if not all of our job, from a remote location. Having said that, what I think has changed in having, a child now who is old enough to be entering the workforce is that generation wants something very different. And I feel like what they want and what they crave is what we wanted when we first started working in the workforce, which was a social, group around them. And so if you say to a brand new graduate, hey, this is your first job and you just need to come to the office on Tuesdays and Thursdays, they feel a little lost on what to do Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Not just because they're not self-starters, because a lot of them are, but it's like, well, do I contact this person if they're not here? They're very comfortable walking to someone's, office or cube. But when you're at home, when you're working on your own, you don't know if you should ping them, if you're disrupting them or bothering them, etc. And, for many of us, again, the way we sort of grew up on our first job was you worked a ton of hours, you worked really hard, but that was also the group that you might go, enjoy an afternoon with after work. And I think that that's, again, sort of a social sphere that's much larger that this, younger workforce is looking for and craving now. And so it's really important that we recognize different generations value different things. And where I see that being really appropriate is trying as best as you can as a company or as a culture to give them where they what they thrive at.
Yeah. Without launching into a whole other conversation, do you think that remote work, or how do you know whether remote work is beneficial to your organization? And then also, how do you go if there's a balance? Let's say you want to do it once or twice a week. What are kind of your thoughts on that for a marketing team or a workplace?
Well, I guess what I'd say is I don't think it's one size fits all.
Mhm.
I feel like there are going to be people who, by their nature, work more, productively on their own, maybe at home with less distraction. There are going to be other people that go, gosh, my distraction is the fact that I have three loads of laundry and I can't seem to get my work done at home. I'm much more focused in an office. And so whether it's possible or not is a different discussion. But I know when we had our sort of return to work policy when I was leading a company, what we did is we identified, where people needed the productivity the most and where their preferences were, and we balanced that ability to give them that with keeping the right sort of data sets that showed us what was getting accomplished. So at the end of the day, there is a culture that says, okay, we want what I call sort of butts and seats and people in an office, which I think is important for the right sort of buzz and fun and that sort of community. But there's also, just like there is on websites, there's also a lot of data that can tell us, how productive people are getting when they set goals, if they're hitting them, if they're missing them, if it's time based, if they're sitting in too many meetings, etc. So I don't think we have to guess at a lot of this. I think ultimately we ask people, we get feedback, and certainly if you're running, a web agency, there may even be time cards that you can run reports on, and you can see, what deliverables are getting met in different kind of time scenarios.
And so to close out the episode, I kind of want to talk about, your way of keeping ahead of the curve and actually learning and continued education. Is there anything that you're doing over the next few months and years to stay ahead of the curve and to actually keep yourself educated as things evolve?
Well, I do consider myself to be a continual learner. I'm one of those people that looks for opportunities to go back and whether it's through a certification or back to school entirely. And, maybe, just because recently I went through an AI certification that was about 10 months long, that was really so I could learn how, AI works back behind the technology by building neural networks myself and understanding the code. But ultimately, for me, it's just about staying curious. It's about staying present. It's about building out agents myself and making sure that I know how all the things work that I'm recommending that, you know, my company does or that others do. So it's really just what I would say is sort of rolling up your sleeves and doing it yourself, because that firsthand knowledge is the most critical in being able to be in a position to make those recommendations for others.
I think that's awesome. Nicki Purcell, where can people find you if they want to contact you or work with Morgans or anything like that?
Yeah, no, I'm on LinkedIn, so that's probably the best way. And please reach out and connect. I'd love to meet with people.
Awesome. It was great to have you on.